Welcome to the Kent Lapp Podcast.
Brad Perry, thanks for being on the podcast.
My pleasure.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. What is your role at Brentwood Academy?
Well, I'm nearing the completion of my 22nd year there. There's been a couple stints, so it's all combined. But I do several things. I mean, I just tell people I'm a teacher. I teach African American history, of which I've taught for 17 years. Also teach a senior Bible class that we call Christian Dynamics. I've been teaching that for 20 years. This year, I'm teaching a world history class to sophomores. That was kind of a last-minute thing.
Okay.
But I'm also our senior grade chair, so I spend a lot of time with seniors. And I'm a middle school football coach and the head high school boys track coach.
So you are. So,
Yeah.
Okay. That's part of the reason I asked was because there's not a whole lot out there on the internet on Brad Perry.
Oh, good.
but there's some, and I saw just today that it looked like maybe you were a coach also there.
Yes, that's a true story.
So you have a lot going on.
I do have a lot going on, yeah.
Now, for those that may not know, can you give us a little bit more info on Brentwood Academy? Because you've had, is it safe to say you've had some NFL players come through there? I mean, I know Jalen Ramsey.
Yeah,
Others?
we've had a few different ones. I mean, I don't know how far going back, but we've certainly had a handful through the years. We're a school, we've been around for 50 years, and we are a Christian school, but we're not connected to any church, so we're not denominationally affiliated. So in some ways, I think this is true. When the school was started, it was really the first one Christian school not affiliated with the church. So it wasand like
Interesting.
like a David Lipscomb, which is Church of Christ, or obviously a Catholic or parochial school.
Mm-hmm.
And we're co-ed, college prep, 6 through 12. We have 700 students this year, so it's, I don't know, some people think that's big, some people think it's small.
Right.
I guess it depends on your perspective.
Yeah.
But like the senior class, we had 109 in the senior class this year. So our class size is going to be in that, low one teens kind of size. So,
Yeah. Well, it's in the context that I grew up in, that's a very large school.
Yeah.
There was 5 in my graduating class.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
It was a very small church school.
Yeah, I graduated from Brentwood Academy, and when I graduated in 92, so it gives you my age, there were 64 in my senior class. So we've grown since that point, obviously.
How often you said you've been there for 22 years teaching? Do people comment on the fact that you don't look like you would be there for 22 years? Do you get that a lot?
I've gotten that. I think I have some good genes on my mom's
side.
I think so. My grandfather had, even before he passed away, he was in his 60s, he had mostly dark hair, so that helps out a little bit.
Yeah,
but
for sure.
If you look close, you can see the grays. So,
how are you doing all of that? You said, you had quite a list there. You're teaching multiple things, you're coaching. It's quite a lot.
Yeah, I think it's a school. One of the things I really like about the school, it's also a challenge, is we're really trying to develop whole people. And, I think we want kids to take risks, try different things. And I think the same with our faculty. We certainly have some, quote, specialists, maybe somebody who's just a great physics teacher or whatever. But for the most part, we're all kind of jumping into different areas of school life. And obviously we'll have some different things that are our expertise. But, so like even my son, who's a senior right now, he has been in every play. He loves theater. He plays football. He runs track. He does youth and government. And so... not that you have to do all those things, but we encourage those things.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Just to be well-rounded.
What was you mentioned something you did with seniors. What was that again?
I'm the grade chair, which
what is that?
Simply means I'm kind of just looking after, and I have a team under me of other faculty members who are focusing on seniors or predominantly teach seniors, and it's just another safety net, I think, for the kids to try to support them at every level. At this point, we're not so much worried about them, sort of getting through school or graduating. It's much more, obviously there's the emotional level, what's going on spiritually, how are they doing, or is there some hard things going on at home that we need to know about? if they are struggling academically somewhere, it's just another place where we can catch them. And obviously the college, getting prepared for college is a big piece of what we try to do as well.
Yeah.
So trying to prepare them in every way, not just academically.
Yeah. Is there hot spots around the country where you see a lot of seniors going to college, either certain parts of the country or certain colleges that you see is common? Or is it
I don't understand.
Like, is there certain colleges that like you see a large majority of students going to, or is it just so scattered? It
definitely depends. I mean, I think obviously. I mean, I think our students this year, I saw the statistics on this, are going to schools in 23 or 4 different states.
Okay.
I think 49 or 50 different colleges.
Okay.
So it can't, obviously, it's interesting because, we are a private school, so parents are paying.
Yeah.
And so a lot of them are hoping that, they can, they're great to get the Hope Scholarship and to go to UT for, much less money than they would even pay for in high school. So, it's an interesting perspective. But we got kids going from, Ivy League schools, SEC schools, all across the country. And so my own son, who I mentioned as a senior, he's going to Georgetown in Washington, D.C. So thankfully he got a lot of money.
Yeah.
Because it ain't cheap.
Really?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
What have you seen? As you were talking, it reminded me. Have you seen the show on Netflix? I think it's called All American. I think it's called All American on Netflix. That ring a bell?
Yes, I have not seen it. I'm familiar with it.
Yeah,
it's kind of funny when the Friday Night Light show came on.
Yeah,
everybody was like, my friends who aren't educators. Oh, I just think about you, or
yeah.
And I was just always kind of gravitate away from those kinds of things.
Sure.
But sort of, I'm sure there's some things that are true there, as it would be in my experience, but some of the cliche kind of high school sports, like the car dealer booster parent who's those kind of weird things. And
I think that's in All American too.
Yeah, the parties at so and so's house. I'm just like, in some cases it's just too close, probably.
Right.
So, yeah.
What would be other schools in Nashville that'd be the most similar to Brentwood?
Good question. So, I think Christ Presbyterian is probably pretty. In fact, the guy who started their high school was an administrator at Brentwood Academy for 10 years.
Who was that?
And Richard Anderson.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Richard Anderson. So, but even there, I pulled back a little bit because even there, obviously, they're church affiliated. So they are. Yeah. So in terms of independent, once again, there's still not really any independent that I can think of off the top of my head. Christian schools, most are still church affiliated. I mean,
interesting.
In terms of athletically speaking, we play public, private schools. So, so there's still that crossover in our league, like Father Ryan's in our league, and MBA, which is not a Christian school, but obviously a long time, really excellent academic institution. Innsworth is in our John Paul II, obviously another Catholic school in North Nashville. So,
Do you know Tom Cox?
I do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Tom and I go to church together. We're currently serve as elders there, and so I know Tom well.
Tom's a great guy, and another example of somebody who is, just an excellent teacher, teaches AP Bio, a very difficult class, but he's also, coaches soccer at the middle school and high school level. And, so he's definitely doing things outside the classroom as well.
Yeah, for sure. This might be a little bit of an unfair question, but what are your thoughts on public schools in Williamson County?
Yeah, I we have great schools in Williamson County. First of all, I went to Franklin City schools growing up. I grew up in Franklin, and so I went to Franklin Elementary, and some of the schools have changed names, but Johnson Elementary. So I had great experiences there, and certainly a lot of our friends, their kids are there. So I can't really, I don't have too much negative to say. I mean, I do think that there's some interesting things in Franklin specifically. this topic of race that comes up. I mean, I do think that there's some inequities, and for instance, most of the African American kids in Franklin go to Centennial. There's a very, very small number at Franklin High School, and so I think there's some how should we say, interesting zoning going on there, to be honest.
Fascinating.
Yeah, because when I was a kid, Franklin was the only public school in the city. I mean, Page, which was more rural. So a lot of my friends who are African American, I mean, they all went to Franklin and had a large African American population. And now that's not the case.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting. Now, I'm not an expert on public schools by any stretch of the imagination, but so is this based on where they happen to live in Franklin, or is there something else going on?
Yeah, it is, but for instance, there are kids who live in some lower income housing across the street from Franklin who are zoned for Centennial, and so. Yeah.
When by nature of their living location, you would think that they would go to school across the street.
Yes.
Oh, fascinating. Yes. Well, yeah, we'll talk
more
about that, I guess.
Later. Yeah. And, there's a lot of factors that play into these things. Franklin has an IB program, International Baccalaureate, which is great. Centennial doesn't. So you can get out of zone if you go into the IB program. And so there's some different things going on there.
With us having 5 kids, and right now they're going to a private school in Old Hickory, but we're looking at other options. What's your kind of general or broad advice for parents that going into middle school? What would you be looking for if you were touring a school, whether that's public or private, for your kids?
Yeah, I think a big thing is if you can get a sense of the people that are working with your children, to me, I think curriculum's important and mission is important. I think if you can somehow get a sense of the individuals and people who are actually going to be working with your children, and once again, I'm a big relationship guy, and if you can get a sense of, I hate to use this word because it's a little dehumanizing, but I want to say the product. I mean, if you can meet children who have been through that school and get a sense of who they are, and to me that those are really big. The people, and I think that's all important, and I do think that people have different parents, I should say, have different goals. So, I have my kids. Have gone through when they are your children's age. They've gone through New Hope Academy in Franklin. I don't know if you know much about New Hope.
Yeah, friends that have sent their kids there.
Yeah, we absolutely would have been great with sending our children to the public schools in Franklin, but we were sort of in on the ground floor at New Hope. The founder of the school, Paige Pitts, who has a pretty big place in my wife and I's story as it relates to race. She mentored my wife and discipled her when she was in high school and college, and so we've been a part of New Hope since it started almost 25 years ago, and so anyway, so I felt very comfortable. So some people, here's my point, almost lost it. Some parents, they really want their kids to go to like a New Hope or maybe a Christian school in elementary, and kind of give them that spiritual foundation, and to teach and to learn from looking through a biblical worldview. But then they kind of want them to go on to a public or a secular, however you want to say it, middle school or high school, because they feel like, okay, this is kind of help prepare them for, quote, the real world. Yeah. Some people would rather do the public thing early on and then use high school to prepare them for the real world of college. Yeah. Some people feel really strongly about the Christian college. Yep. So it's interesting to see parents, and obviously there's monetary factors that play into all this.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, certainly. Now, I'm kind of curious when it comes to college, would you actually prefer your kids to go to secular college, or would you prefer them to go to Christian college, or do you think it just depends on the kid and what you're looking for and that type of thing?
I do think it depends on the kid. I mean, it's a little bit of a cop-out answer, but I mean, we're very comfortable. I mean, let's put it this way: my oldest son started at Oberlin College, which some people would say, oh, and maybe we can talk about this word later, but that's a very liberal school, and that's maybe they might even say it's an anti-God school. I don't know. We really felt like that would be a great place for him to be stretched and to meet new people. I mean, I think for him even to grow up a little bit in his Christian faith, and he ended up leaving after a year, not because of any of those things. He really did have a good experience. He's at Belmont now. But obviously our second son is going to Georgetown, which has an incredible Jesuit tradition. I was this close to doing a master's degree on Jesuit education, and they're very, even though they're very open to people of all faiths and creeds coming to there. They have a real sense of social justice and service in the community, and that's pretty intentional for them, even at the college level. But I don't really. I'm not thinking of it as like a traditional kind of Christian school, like maybe a Lipscomb or a Samford down in Birmingham or something. So,
Have you seen the documentary Waiting for Superman? It's about education reform. Mostly, I think it's grade schools. I don't think it really gets into college.
I have. It's God. What's the guy's name?
Let's see here. I can't remember.
It's the
main guy's
Bueller
name.
Guy Bueller.
Okay. the only guy that's coming to mind is are you saying the Ferris Bueller guy narrated it?
I think he's got a place in that. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh, I didn't even pick up on that.
Yeah. So
okay, fascinating. The only guy that's coming to mind. Well, I know there's a school. There's a guy, the CEO of Valor Collegiate Academy, off of Nolensville. Todd Dixon was. Had a very brief part in there.
Okay, that's cool.
And we toured Valor just to see what's going on over there. Yeah. And it's pretty fascinating. Yeah, really fascinating. But yeah, that was an interesting documentary.
Yeah, it's been a while for me, so I couldn't speak to it with much.
Yeah. I was waiting for Superman, just about education reform.
Yeah,
and kind of the inequities that we see in public education kind of across the country. And stuff. So yeah, it was pretty fascinating.
Let's put it this way. I mean, maybe to get back to your question. As a Christian who cares about issues of race and socioeconomic inequality and care for the poor, I am constantly checking my motives and thinking, man, should I be doing something else? Should I be somewhere else? Should I be? And we give a lot of financial aid, and so we've had some intentionality about diversity at our school. But maybe I'm just speaking for myself, so I don't want to throw any judgment out there. But I think if I'm not asking these kind of questions, then I'm probably not in a great place.
Yeah, interesting. So is it? Are you saying then, in so many words, that maybe sometimes you may have some feelings of guilt about what you're doing or who you're teaching? Or
yes, I think that's fair.
What's kind of required to get into your school, and it's such a high level of. I mean, it really is a great school. I've heard really good things about Brentwood Academy.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, I think that I think excellent education, shouldn't be I think it's should be a right. It should be a privilege. And it should be something, in my opinion, that everyone should have access to. And I've, not to, I would say the same thing about healthcare.
Right.
Obviously there's different ways to go about it, and none of these are easy solutions. That's why they keep doing documentaries, as you said, about all these problems. But so it's something that I keep thinking about. I mean,
I can see that.
Yeah, I mean, New Hope Academy, when it was started as they are intentionally multiracial and diverse socioeconomically. So they've capped each of their classrooms. I mean, literally their classrooms. They have two classes per grade, and each classroom has no more than 14 students.
Okay.
And at least 6 of those seats in that room, 6 to 8, are going to be for low income students.
Oh, wow. I didn't know it was that much.
Yeah, it's intentional. So, and I mean, it's a small school, 220 students. But in terms of the numbers of even immigrants, where kids have come from, the number of countries that are represented, large Hispanic population that they're serving, African American, and so they've been able to maintain that. And Page's philosophy, and even to this day, and I was on the board at one point, is if at some point we can't fulfill this mission, then we're going to close our doors. We're not going to all of a sudden say, well, that's okay. We'll just have 4 students per class, or 2, or if. Yeah, I mean, Williamson County is obviously a very affluent county, and if it ever gets to the point where there's literally no people living below the poverty line, then the school will close.
Does New Hope Academy have any trouble getting enough of people in there?
Not really. I mean, there's been some ebbs and flows, and I think the truth is, as I told you, I grew up in Franklin. The numbers, even racial numbers, have really gone down. I mean, Williamson County has become more affluent and more white over the last 40 years. So
interesting.
So in some ways, I mean, they do have to be intentional about getting the word out. But at this point, they're far enough along where, they're in a pretty good place in terms of people knowing who they are and what they're doing. Yeah. And they're doing it, they're a classical school and doing it, a Christian classical school. So
friends that send their kids there love it, man. They speak very, very highly of that school, very highly.
Well, that's great to hear.
I think that's a fascinating kind of internal struggle that I guess I hadn't actually ever really thought of. For you, with what you care about and those types of things, kind of reasoning through where you're basically like where you're going to take your talents, for them to be kind of relayed to other people. Do you think that, because I'm assuming like most of the public schools, even in Davidson County, would gladly take you, right? I mean, that's kind of an assumption, but it sounds like you're a great teacher. So pretty much most schools are probably going to take you. However, as you kind of think through that, it's probably also fair to say that you may have a greater impact at some schools than others based on the people in charge and the structure and everything like that. So, as it relates to getting good education available for more people, do you think it's that really great teachers kind of just need to go out into the system, or is it that the system needs to change and bring these maybe lower income schools into kids into better schools?
Wow. That's a really good question. And there's so many levels to this.
Yeah.
I mean, so I'm going to start, I guess, with the personal aspect for me. I do think that I have felt at some level called, it's a bit of a loaded word, but called to speak to Christians or to speak in a church setting, or which I consider our school, and maybe I'm open to maybe more of the people that I'm really called to teach to are white people who maybe are ignorant of some of these issues.
Interesting.
Talking about race or care for the poor. And I use that word ignorant in the truest sense, and a lack of knowledge, not a backward or
oblivious.
And we don't know what we don't know sometimes. And so I do think that there's a part of that's felt compelling for me, at least, as long as I'm still doing what I'm doing. Maybe I'm just using all this to justify what I'm doing, but
no, I mean,
I do think that there's a lot of,
I actually really like that.
Yeah. So I think that there's a piece of that. I don't know how far you want to go down this road either,
Yeah.
but I did help some friends of ours. We moved to Chicago to try to essentially start a high school in inner city Chicago, like New Hope. In some ways, it would be maybe like maybe a combination of New Hope and Brentwood Academy in the inner city of Chicago. And I was there for 1 year. And that's, there's a little side story there, but so I do think that I do really believe in the New Hope model. And I do think that, and certainly this sort of model has been replicated in other parts of the country. People have come to New Hope, and there's been other schools like it.
Yeah.
And even looking at the high school level. So there is some of that's been happening. So from a personal standpoint, I think that, I don't know. So
to put it bluntly, do you think that you have some influence in your circles, white, with maybe some affluence that maybe someone who wasn't white and maybe who wasn't as affluent maybe wouldn't have the same level of influence?
Yeah.
Because of who the message is coming from, that helps the message?
I think it's fair to say that this is not as much personal, but I do think it's fair to say that if, for a lot of white kids who might come in with a certain bent, and this kind of maybe opens up a discussion topic, but I think that it's harder for them to hear about race from an African American person.
Yeah, I've wondered about that. I've wondered about that more in the last kind of week or two than I have in a while.
Yeah,
and that's what I like about your heart and your vision and kind of your calling, so to speak, for what you're doing. I mean, I think that I can really see where that would be effective. I mean, to be honest with you, when we first talked or when I first found out about you, I was like, oh, fascinating. You teach African American history. I wouldn't, you know what I mean? Like, I wouldn't have guessed that.
Right.
It was almost, it was surprising, I guess, a little bit.
Oh, no,
in a really good way.
I've gotten that a lot
in a really
through
good
the years.
Let's dive into that. But first, when was the Chicago thing? What year was that? Or how recent?
05, 06. So it's been a little while.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Did you consider living in Chicago?
Oh, yeah. We moved there fully intending to make that our home. I mean,
oh, wow.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if we thought we'd be there for 50 years, but I think we thought we'd be there at least for 5 or maybe 10.
Yeah.
Our oldest child went to, he had gone to pre-kindergarten at New Hope and went to kindergarten there. And our 4th child, Jack, was born in Chicago. And,
okay.
Yeah. So.
Didn't love the city or?
Loved the city.
Did you really?
I did, yeah.
Oh, okay.
We did.
I don't hear that too often.
We did. We had a very quintessential experience. I mean,
really?
We lived right beside the school. It's funny. I was driving here today thinking, I haven't been on the interstate in 2 months.
Yeah. Well, you're not missing much.
Living in Franklin, yeah. And, I'd really just haven't driven my car much. Well, when I lived in Chicago, I would go for a couple of weeks without driving it because we walked everywhere, used the L.
Yep.
So we had a real, my wife, obviously when I was working and she had, young kids to care for. She had to be real creative about figuring out where the parks are and getting the free museum stuff.
Yeah.
What stuff's free? What days can you go?
Yeah.
But she's an incredible woman and she loved all that. And so, we love, going to cheap White Sox games. They won the World Series when we were there. That was cool.
Really?
Yeah. So we're White Sox fans, not Cubs fans.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So
that's a big deal. I've only been to Chicago a couple times. Really enjoyed my time there. Although I have thought, if I had to live in a different city, I'm not sure that Chicago would be top of the list.
Yeah. The weather can be brutal.
Yeah.
And it's when, the winter just won't quit, even in mid-May.
Yeah.
That's when it gets hard. But,
for sure. Well, we're from upstate New York, so we know a little bit about that too. That's part of the reason we moved here in 2014 was to get away from that.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear more about your family story. Sounds like you have quite a history here in Williamson County.
Yeah. So it's funny when I tell people that I've lived here my whole life, they're like, oh, you're one of the few. I've lived here. I grew up in Franklin, as I said. My children are 10th generation. Williamson Countyans or Franklinites. And so,
not even Middle Tennessee, like Williamson County.
Yes.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. I mean, so I tell people, downtown Franklin is always hopping, and, it's, I don't know if cool's quite the right word, but it's happening. There's a lot going on.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. And, but when I was a kid, I was like tumbleweed going down Main Street. I mean, everything closed early. There was just a couple, it was just a lot of kind of old, kind of kitschy shops on Main Street, not a lot of, bars or, food establishments or anything, that kind of stuff. And so the town's really changed. But anyway, so my children are 10th generation, Williamson County. Going back, I think my family first moved here in the 1760s, so even pre-Revolutionary War.
Wow.
Fast forwarding a little bit, they had some money, they had means, they literally had plantations that are still in our county. I mean, just a few miles from where I live. At one point, I think it was 1841, my family was the largest slaveholding family in Williamson County, over 240 slaves. And so it's something that, I talk with a lot of students, and when we teach African American history, of course, a lot of people are like, well, my family didn't own slaves, and I'm not racist and all that. Right. Well, I say, well, I can't say that.
Yeah.
My family did. And so that's part of our story. It's just really interesting. I mean, I can, when I was a kid, I lived with my grandparents for a good part of growing up for a couple different reasons. And I can remember, not that the Confederacy was like something that there wasn't a lot of like that tradition kind of stuff, but I remember they had like these framed pictures of Confederate money in one of their rooms, and they had a picture of the Battle of Franklin that had both sides, Oh,
okay.
And I knew that I had family members who were in the Confederacy, and, it was weird. That's just this kind of, I don't know, the weird tension, I think, of race in the South for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And so I can remember my grandfather had construction business, and he had a lot of African Americans who worked for him, and I think was generally seen as they connected well, kind of cross-culturally. But at the same time, I can remember him saying the N-word,
Your
as
grandfather?
a kid. Oh, yeah. And so, that's very, and I can remember my, just other family members saying things like that, or talking about like where African Americans lived in Franklin, calling it Colored Town.
Wow, yeah.
So I can just remember those things. But then at the same time, my grandparents, they moved to Atlanta for about a 10-year period in my mom's growing up years. So she actually went to high school in Atlanta. My uncle, who's younger than her, went to the same school as Dr. King's children, sorry.
Oh, wow.
And my aunt, who is currently a state Supreme Court justice. That's a little humble brag there.
Yeah, there we go.
Nothing to do with me, but
that's cool. What's her name?
Her name is Justice Cornelia Clark, Connie Clark. So she's been on the. So anyway, but she was she went to the same high school, and she actually worked on Andrew Young's campaign, who was I think he was the second African American mayor of Atlanta, and he was one of the. I mean, he was with Dr. King in Memphis when he was shot. He was at Selma. I mean, he was a great civil rights leader, still alive today, actually, and helped get the Olympics to Atlanta. So, I guess I'm just trying to say that. So I have this, this tension in my family. So my aunt, who was, I would say somebody who was really active for civil rights. I'm talking 70s and 80s, and she was a lawyer, and yet then I have my grandfather who, used the N-word. My parents. I played sports when I was a kid, and as I said, went to public school, and it was very diverse in Franklin back in the day. So I would have friends or African American come spend a night at my house, and I would go to their houses, and my parents never acted like that was weird. And as simple and as obvious as that might sound, I think that was a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
Looking back on it, didn't think about it at the time. So when I mentioned to you on the phone, and I don't know if I'm getting too long-winded here,
No, you're good.
When I became a Christian in high school, I was 16 and right at the beginning of my junior year in high school, I got pretty early on connected to a guy named Scott Rowley, who was a pastor at Christ Community Church. And he was sort of a hippie-looking guy who was the youth leader, but he had a real heart for racial reconciliation.
Okay.
And so he would have these Bible studies where he would go into, parts of Franklin where there were all African Americans right in downtown, and he would have these Bible studies of mostly African American kids, a few white kids, and I got involved in that. And we would play basketball, then study the Bible, and he was just, really intentional that way. And so that's in some ways my Christian. It kind of got into the DNA of my Christian experience and what it meant to be a Christian for me. And so, he was really important in my life. And then I mentioned Paige Pitts, who started New Hope, was discipled my wife, and they had a Franklin Community Ministries, which was out of Christ Community Church back when it was a downtown Franklin before the new building out Hillsborough Road. They were just really intentional about doing all these cross-racial ministries. And there was a tapestry group, which was getting together women of different races. And I mentioned, the Bible studies. I mean, New Hope Academy essentially came out of it. Strong Tower Bible Church, where Chris Williamson is still the pastor. He was an intern and worked closely with Scott and Paige, and he's African American, just to be clear to all the listeners. And so Strong Tower, which is a really intentionally racially diverse church, was started, and that. So all those things, my formative years, as a Christian, was in that environment.
Wow. Like in your late teens,
mid
to late teens.
Yeah. So and I know it doesn't look like it. I played college football, and and I was a wide receiver.
Okay.
And so I tell this to my class. There's not many times where white people living in Williamson County are in the minority, and so there was one year where all of my people in the receiver group and my head receiver coach were all African American.
Really?
And in college, you spend a lot of time with your group, whether it's offensive line, whatever position group. You watch tons of film. You have lots of meetings. There's lots of, lots of those things going on. So, so I was, for those moments, I was the minority. Yeah. And even in my other years playing, there was always more African American in the room, African Americans in the room, and so I don't know, just all these things play into it. I love history, and so I'm just constantly reading books about African American history. I've the new Jim Crow. I'm looking at that right now, so that's where I'm spending a lot of time right now. I'm reading a book about when Dean Smith, who's a basketball coach at North Carolina, when he integrated the team, and how it was just this big ordeal in Chapel Hill, North Carolina in the 60s when Charlie Scott played basketball for North Carolina. I'm reading that for fun. So I guess that all plays into why African American history. So
that's a fascinating story. Wow. That's really exceptional. That is. Now, did you in your mid-teens, did you know that, 16, 17, when you got involved with the guy from Christ Community Church, and Paige, was it? Mm-hmm. Did you know already in your teens, like you really wanted to kind of focus on this racial issue, or was that later on? No,
I think I knew pretty early on that it was important to me.
And but after you became a believer?
Yeah. After, and I think that it had to do with, I don't know. I think just from playing sports and comfort level with people of different races. I don't know how much. If you're into the Enneagram at all, I'm a little bit. I'm a 9. Over there. Yeah. I'm a 9.
Okay. My wife's a 9,
which I didn't.
That's why I like you so much right out of the gate.
Of course, I wasn't thinking about, but I do have this sense in me, this piece of me that's, I don't know if, nines are supposed to be peacemakers. I tell, my wife, nines seem like wimps, but I feel like a wimp. But I think I do have this sense that I just really want it sounds so cliche, but I really want everybody to get along and love each other.
Yeah, no, that
and
makes
it's
sense.
so basic and way easier to say than do. But, and I think I just recognized, and it's a little bit looking back now, but, I can remember driving through as a kid in the predominantly African-American neighborhoods to get to school that were poor areas, and just feeling this sense of compassion and empathy. And even though I couldn't put my finger on it, I certainly couldn't articulate it, but that didn't feel right. And I didn't, I just wondered about the people who lived in that home that's kind of dilapidated and things like that. I mean, I just have very vivid memories of that. And so I don't know if you can call that a sense of justice, but I think it probably was just much more of a sense of compassion and something tore at me even before I was a Christian. I'm talking about as an elementary school kid. And I did have, and I think about it now. I mean, I had African-American teachers. I had a principal when I was in middle school who was African-American woman, Mary Mills, who's sort of a education legend in Franklin. And, and those things I didn't really think twice about back in the day, but now looking back, I'm thinking was probably pretty rare, pretty unique. And, so, yeah.
Well, nines aren't wimps or weaks. Whatever you said is definitely not true. My wife is probably the strongest person I know. She's very, very strong. And I believe Abraham Lincoln was a 9.
Wow. Well, there you go.
So
well,
you're in good.
I'll take it.
You're
I'll
in
take
good
it.
company.
I'll take it.
Going back to the how would have your grandfather owned slaves or your dad's grandfather?
No, it's on my mom's side of the family. So, this is like 5 generations back. So it
would have been that long ago?
Yeah. My great grandmother, I'm doing the math real quick. Yeah, I think it's 5 generations, maybe 4.
Okay.
Maybe 4 generations back. Just to put a name on it, if you go out Del Rio Pike in Franklin, which is a beautiful area along the Harpeth River, there's a plantation that was called, it still is called Meeting of the Waters, because I think it's the Little Harpeth and the Harpeth met at that point, and it's right there. And then Montpelier subdivision, there's a Montpelier. There was another plantation home that was in our family. So it's right out there. So it's still technically in Franklin, but it's
now would those
rural.
be would that be like protected now for like historical things?
Actually, there's actually private residence still.
Oh yeah,
yeah, it's pretty rare, but yeah, it's private
still in the family.
Yeah,
or?
No, it's not.
It's been
one thing that I don't mean to laugh. My family, I think, also was not very good with money. One of the things I learned too. So I joke. I don't believe this theologically, but God's punishment for some of the bad things they did. But no, they. My family had a lot of holdings that none of it got down to my generation. So
really?
I'm fine with that.
Now, what would have been going on at those plantations, like the ones here in Franklin? Raising cotton, or what was the industry?
Not a lot of cotton. It was much more crops like corn, soybeans, things like that. There's some cotton in Middle Tennessee, but it's a little more, much more prevalent as you go west. Once you cross the Tennessee River, if you just take I-40, even today, if you're driving there in late fall, early winter, you'll see the cotton from the interstate. So kind of Jackson, Tennessee, right to Memphis, and obviously if you carry on into Mississippi, Arkansas. So not a lot of cotton here, mostly staple crops.
Interesting, like
food crops,
like corn and soybeans. So back
tobacco
then,
as well. Tobacco's
really?
Big, yeah.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
So back then, now we have a combine. Someone jumps in the combine and goes and knocks out a cornfield in no time. But back then they didn't have that, and they would use the slave labor as free labor.
Absolutely.
To harvest the crops and do whatever. Tend to the crops.
Right.
I see. And then they would provide room and board and feed them and everything. And
yeah, I mean, obviously, the we even using the term room and board, working at colleges right now, and some of these colleges have, that's really nice. Most of the slave quarters were obviously very meager. I mean, holes in walls and sometimes even dirt floors. I mean, if you get Carton Plantation, Carton Mansion in Franklin, which is a historic venue where they have tours and stuff. You may have been there. Yeah, they actually have a slave quarters that they've kind of kept intact and that sort of thing out there. And that's something that I would highly recommend people to go check out just to get a sense of, what that might have been like. And so
have you ever struggled with this guilt that we talked about a little bit earlier? Have you struggled with something like that as it relates to your family's history? Was it the type of thing that at some point you kind of just repented of, like the heritage yourself or the history yourself, and then you're going to need to move on, right? I mean,
I appreciate you saying that because I have repented of that, and some people are like, well, why did you need to do that when this was your family? Can you be held accountable for literally the sins of your fathers, as it were, your great grandfathers? And for me, I can't speak for everybody, but for me, I felt like it was really important to repent of that, because I do think that there is something that gets passed down in our DNA.
Yeah.
I do think that the sin of slavery, the sin of white supremacy, if we want to put it on the other side, does get passed down. And sometimes it can look way more subtle than, having slaves who are working for free in your fields. But I really felt like at a pretty young age in my faith journey that I did need to repent of that. And also still recognize that, hey, just because I didn't own slaves doesn't mean that I don't have the stain of racism. And I pretty much tell my students, we're all white and we're all racist at some level. And, we like to sugarcoat it and say, well, I'm a little prejudiced or I might have this bias. But I do think that we all have this stuff, this junk in us. So I felt like it was important for me to repent. So I don't think about it. There is something called white guilt. So I don't think about, I don't know if I feel guilty about my family's history, but I do feel like it's a story that needs to be told, and I feel like that I need to be very honest about that. And I talk every year. I talk to my students about it.
Okay,
and we have a little project where I have them I try to get them to trace their family history, to go back as far as they can.
Okay,
and then trace it forward. And if there is, not that you're making anything up, but if there is any connection with race issues, then let's tell us about that.
Yeah.
And so I have black and white students who are doing this. So it's been fascinating, some of the stories that people have told through the years. So I think it's important for me to tell my story.
Yeah. I think that's what I'm finding so fascinating and interesting and compelling, is because of your history, but also the fact that then your heart for these types of things. And then the fact also that you're willing to talk about it very openly. Yeah, that's very powerful. Very powerful. I could see this having a trickle effect. And while I've only heard about you, I guess, in the last few days, honestly, you've been at this for years. So you've been planting seeds for years.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it's going to bear fruit.
I hope so. I hope it has.
I'm sure it has.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things. It's like, I'm sure in your life you have things that you're passionate about, and I have things that I'm passionate about, and you can't get rid of it. And I've had times, and even recently, where I've been like, God, I hate that I care about this. I want to not care about it. I want to not think about it now. And then I'm quickly confronted with I'll say it. This is a loaded term, but my white privilege to say, of course, I can say that. I mean, it's at some level, I can walk away from it. Whereas if you're African American, especially living in the South,
yes,
you can't walk away from it. You always are marked by it.
Yes,
and I guess my point is that I really can't either. I mean, because it's a passion of mine, and though there's moments where I'm just like, I
Yeah,
wish I didn't care.
Well, I appreciate you actually saying that, because driving here today, the thought crossed my mind, I'm like, man, I don't know how, Anthony Hendricks was on here yesterday. It's not live yet, but it will be soon. And he's awesome, by the way. I really enjoyed meeting Anthony. That was a real privilege.
He's a 7.
Oh,
by
is
the way.
he?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. 7 on the Enneagram.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, I was just, I don't know. I was thinking like, man, this is one of the things that frustrates me, but these discussions can become political so quick, and I don't particularly care for political type discussions.
Yes.
And like, man, why do you need to just stay away from this? And then I'm like, but then I was like, the next thought is, no, but you believe that the Bible has some things to say about this. You believe that the heart of God has some things to do with this, quite a lot actually.
Yep.
And in whatever little small thing you're doing, if you care about this, you can't quit, So even though it'd be easier just to stay away from it for the sake of relationship with family or certain friends or, that type of a thing.
Yeah.
But,
well, there's definitely, well, I'm going to back up real quick. I appreciate you saying that, because, I can teach my class from a Christian perspective. And so the very first thing that I teach, before we get into the quote history, is I just teach on race in the Bible. And I do think that there's a lot of things that the Bible has to say, and obviously the heart of God, that is foundational for these principles that we'll talk about when we talk about racial unity or racial reconciliation, however you want to say it. And so, though I can certainly go talk to a group of people who aren't Christian, and I'm still very comfortable having this conversation as a Christian. I think that our faith has a lot to say about it, and for me, to ignore it would be, well, it'd probably be sin for me to ignore it.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. And the other thing is, like, if we both feel this way at some point, me too, certainly you're way more involved here, but I would assume other people feel the same way at some point. But if everyone just decides they're not going to do it, or it's too political, or they're going to stay away from the issue, then it's not going to change, and that's just unacceptable.
Yeah, yeah. I think people use politics as a reason not to get into it, or a reason to write it off. Unfortunately, right. I think sometimes, for evangelical Christians, conservative Christians, race sometimes is seen as a quote liberal issue, and if it's liberal, therefore it must be bad, and so I need to, kind of steer away from it. And I think we can define the term liberal in different ways, but I would say that's probably a poor way of looking at it.
I think that's a very poor way of looking at it, but it's the way most people look at it, to be honest. And also, this is kind of the thing too that I've thought about just in recent times too, is look, if to care about education reform, to care about justice, true justice being done in our criminal justice system, to care about these types of racial reconciliation type issue. If you need to be tagged as a liberal to care about these things, then I guess tag me as a liberal.
Yeah.
Because the Bible doesn't shy away from getting into these things. As a matter of fact, it talks quite a lot about these types of things. Looking out for those that can't look out for themselves, taking care of the weak, doing justice. I mean, these things are in the Bible. And so it's kind of unfortunate that we're in a world or a culture right now where everything is so politicized. It's either the conservative right, or the crazy left, and then we tend to just use that, like you said, as an example to stay away from topics, and that's just not. We can't do that.
Yeah, I think one thing. It's funny. I heard in a podcast coming over here. I listened to part of it the other day, and I was trying to finish it, and it was a doctor. He was talking, and he's done a lot of work on, because they were talking about COVID-19 and some of the racial discrepancies or inconsistencies about how it's disproportionately impacted people of color in our country.
I didn't know that.
It's crazy statistics, but
really?
30% of those infected by the coronavirus are African American. And
they don't account for 30% of the population, correct?
No, it's about 13%. And a higher percentage have actually died from it, pushing 50. And it's almost state by state.
Pushing 50%?
Yeah, of those who have died, yes. And it's almost state by state. And he was reading off the statistics. He didn't go through every state, but 4 or 5 states. So it was like, I'm paraphrasing, but Georgia is like a state that has 16% African-American population. I think 36% of those infected were African-American, and the death rate is like 53%, I think, in the state of Georgia. And he read off 3 or 4 states that were very similar. So I guess the point I want to get back to is, in 1978, the high point of the closing of the income disparity, where by 1978 African Americans made 59 cents for every dollar that the white Americans made. Okay, that was the high point
in 78.
In 78, and the number today is 59 cents as well, and that figure has fluctuated 3 or 4 cents both ways from that point. So I guess one of the things that when I talk about race to people is I just make the point that African Americans, generally speaking, by numbers, make less. And the wealth disparity is much more. So it's about a dime for a dollar.
What you're talking about is income.
Yeah. So the first is just actual money coming in, but wealth is, once again, we talked about safety nets earlier. Wealth has to do with safety nets and other means of income, or that you've even, if you inherit money or all that stuff. So it's even a greater disparity. So one of the things when I talk about race, I say, African Americans generally are less educated, make less money, have less wealth. They have poorer health care. I mean, you can go down all down the line with, all these kind of fundamental things that we think are important, whether it's with your own children, how you want to raise your family. And African Americans have it worse off than white Americans in almost all these categories, generally speaking, as we look at the pot. And so my point is, why is that the case? We can look at a couple. We can say a couple generally. We can say, you can say they're just not as smart, or they don't work as hard, or I don't believe those things are true. I think it's because of a lot of it has to do with our history. And so, the motto for my class is race matters. I think it does matter. People say, oh, I'm colorblind, I don't see race. I understand what you mean. Okay,
right.
I get that. But, God made us. This is how he made us.
Yeah.
My gender, my race, my whatever, my job might not be the most important thing, but they're still important. And we should never minimize that. So race matters. And the parable of the Good Samaritan is a great example of that. Jesus told a story that did not happen. Okay. In one sense, it happened all the time. It's a story. He could have made anybody the hero of the story. He's making the names up. He could have said a dude, and he made a Samaritan the hero. Okay. They didn't have different skin color, but it was a different race and different culture. And he's making a really profound point in that story. And that's one of the things that I talk about when we talk about race. So race matters. The second part of the motto is history. Our history matters. It matters, where we've come from. Our history does impact our present, and it will impact our future. We're not always defined by it, and we can grow from it, and positive things can come from it, but our history matters. And I think all those disparities that we see have to do with our history, which is also linked to our race.
Yes.
And the third part of the motto for me is that Jesus matters. I think Jesus can speak to all those things. And so to me, when I talk about, even as people want to talk about how all the laws are equal, and they'll even say, I don't believe this is always true, but all the opportunities are equal today. Things have gotten better, but we still have all these disparities, all these gaps. You've heard it over and over about church being segregated and churches being segregated, and where we live, we're segregated, and even how we work. And I just don't think that's how God wanted it to be. Yeah, that's not the image we have of heaven in Revelation.
Yes,
either,
absolutely, absolutely. Do I have it corrected at some point? When black people could vote, their vote counted for 3/5 of a vote. Do I have that right?
No. Well, okay. So in the Constitution, our Constitution's a living document, meaning that everything that was ever written in it is never erased. It gets amended. So when the Constitution was ratified in 1787, it said three things about race. It said that slaves counted as 3/5 of a person. That's interesting, and the debate. Everything about the way our country was founded was really set on compromise, really about slavery, because by the time the Revolutionary War was over, the southern states, the economy had become so enmeshed or so supported by slavery that they weren't willing to get rid of it. Right. The country was very fragile when it came together. And so the northern states, they couldn't, if they would have said, hey, you don't have a choice, we can't have slavery anymore, they would have just broken apart. And there was always fear that big bad England was going to come back and fight again. And they did, actually, 20 years later, 25 years later. So slavery just kept getting compromised until there had to be a war fought over it, essentially.
Interesting.
So anyway, to answer your question, slaves counted as 3/5 of a person. The interesting thing about that topic is that southern states wanted slaves to count as whole people. Northern, they're not really states, we're talking about the representatives, said, well, you can't have your cake and eat it too, because if slaves got counted as more people, why did that matter? Well, it made the population higher, which meant they could get more representatives or more congressmen in the House of Representatives, because the House of Representatives is based on population.
Oh, wow. So the very motivation of them wanting to count them as a whole person was in itself selfish.
Yes, and the northern states are basically saying, you're gonna really want to count these as whole people, yet you don't treat them like human beings. You don't treat them like people. You treat them like animals. In fact, the very notion of a slave was that they were considered property, not a person. So they compromised and made slaves count as 3/5 of a person. So if the state of Georgia had 1 million slaves, then that would count as 600,000 additional, which not only actually got you more representatives in Congress, but it actually got you more federal monies for things that might come up.
Yeah.
So it said that. It also said that the international slave trade would continue for 20 more years. So until 1807, that you could continue to bring in new slaves from outside the country. In 1807, the slave trade was ended. Okay. Now, obviously, people still did it illegally. There were still illegal slaves illegally being brought into the country. But at that point, the slave population was so large that it was just perpetuating itself through childbirth. And there was a really thriving domestic slave trade where people might own slaves in Roanoke, Virginia, and sell them to people who lived in Alabama. And the country's expanding.
That was still legal. That was still legal.
The internal, yes.
Yeah.
The
domestic was
slave
fine.
trade.
International was not.
Yeah. So that was another compromise. Southerners wanted to continue forever. Northerners said no, and so they said, okay, 20 more years. And the third thing that the Constitution said was that was the fugitive slave clause. So it said that if I owned a slave living in Tennessee and my slave ran away to your farm in upstate New York, by law, you're to return that slave to the authorities so that slave could be brought back to the South. This is a really important point because, one thing that's universally true about slaves, they don't like to be slaves and they're going to try to run away.
Yeah.
And so this fugitive slave clause said that slaves were to be returned to their rightful owners. And in some ways, what's kind of insidious about this is it implicated everybody in slavery. So even if
it did.
They ran away to free New York, in this case, they were still bound by that law that said slavery was legal. And ultimately, the whole idea of states' rights, and this isn't even written into the Constitution, it was just understood that individual states could decide if they were going to. It was their right to decide if slavery was legal or not. And at that time in our country, for many people, there was a greater affinity connection to being a Tennessean than even an American. It's a little hard for us to understand unless
you're in Texas.
That's what I was about to say. My friends from Texas,
they get it.
Yes, they get it, and I have several. And that's so funny. So all those things are written into the Constitution, and it took the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, to change that 3/5 compromise. The 14th and 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment actually gave African Americans the right to vote, males, in 1870. So that was 5 years after the Civil War. Now, before that, some states and some communities did allow for African Americans to vote, but what the 15th Amendment did is it federalized it, and it said, across the country, all African-American males have the right to vote. So the point being that it took those amendments to change those laws. So,
and that was 1865?
1865 for the 13th Amendment, 1870 for the 15th.
1870 for the 15th Amendment, which is where all black males across the country could vote.
Yes.
I see. Gotcha.
And this is all during Reconstruction.
Yeah. So. Yep. What stood out to me, and this is partly why I asked about the 3/5 thing, is because that's basically the number that you just said. Income disparity between black and whites is about 59 cents or 60 cents on the dollar.
Yeah,
that's about 3/5.
It is. Yeah.
So in some ways, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you've ever seen the movie Selma, it's well done, but obviously a lot of great documentaries about it. I mean, in Dallas County, which is where Selma is located, is the county seat of Dallas County. In 1965, 100 years after the Civil War, they had a population of over 50% African Americans, and only 1% were actually registered to vote. And that's where Jim Crow comes in. All these Jim Crow laws that were put in to circumvent the actual laws that had been handed down by the Supreme Court and the U.S. Constitution to keep African Americans from voting, because that's where power is. That took another 100 years.
Well, that's what I was just going to say is how did we go from 1870, say, or 1865 was when the international. That's when all slave trade was supposed to stop.
Well,
for the international slave trade.
1865 is the ending of the Civil War. Okay, that's when the Civil War ended. So, and that's also when the 13th Amendment was passed.
Okay.
To abolish slavery.
Okay.
Yeah. So
then we have, and so I think some people are like, 1865, that was a long time ago.
Right.
However, then you run into some of these things that happened in the 60s and 70s. We're like, man, we didn't actually progress that much.
Right.
Interracial marriage wasn't legal in Alabama until November of 2000.
Right.
It wasn't being enforced.
Right.
But my understanding it wasn't legal until 2000.
Right.
So what happened in that it kind of seems like a lost 100 year. What happened in that 100 years where we didn't keep progressing like maybe we should have?
I think several things happened. I do think that there was a real sense, especially after Reconstruction ended, that so I definitely don't want. I'm not letting the northern states off the hook. That they were kind of like, just going to let the South do what they want to do, and slavery's ended. And so there just wasn't a lot of oversight. What Reconstruction did was it gave oversight to what was happening. There were actually troops in the South, and and a lot of Southerners resented that, I'm sure. But they were also making sure that African Americans weren't deprived of their rights. They could vote. It was the first time there was an institution called the Freedmen's Bureau, which was really partially government funded, but there's also some private funding that started schools for African Americans because only about 5% of slaves were literate. So during this Reconstruction period, Fisk in Nashville was started. It was one of the schools started by the Freedmen's Bureau. Howard in Washington, D.C., Morehouse, where Dr. King went in Atlanta. So schools were started for African Americans, hospitals were built, libraries, etc. But when Reconstruction ended, the troops were pulled out of the South. And in some ways, I tell my students, the clock turned back to before the Civil War. And that's when, the KKK, nobody's checking them. So the KKK comes to power. What's the KKK? It's a terrorist organization.
Mm-hmm.
We understand what that means post 9/11. Well, terrorism had been around for a long time, even in our country. They were putting terror into the hearts of African Americans or anybody who was sympathetic to them, and to, quote, keep them in their place. And in some places in our country, they were, let's look at the town of city of Birmingham. In the 1950s, it was believed that about 40% of the police force were also in the KKK. And so, all these institutions are meshing to keep African Americans,
Mm-hmm.
quote, in their place.
Mm-hmm.
In all these towns and cities, states, African Americans there's no African Americans who are state senators, who are on local school boards, who are principals of schools, as we've talked about, who are running businesses, at least in a large scale. There's a wholly dominant white power structure.
Yeah.
So,
was Reconstruction that was a federal basically initiative? What was it that formalized?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's more than just a term for a period of time. Like, this was actually something we were trying to accomplish.
Yeah. There was a few things going on. I mean, for one thing, they're also part of Reconstruction was rebuilding the South. I mean, 95% of the railroads in the South were destroyed because of the Civil War. So there was a lot of literally reconstructing going on of the physical. They were also trying to restructure and rebuild the laws because all these states left the Union. They formed their own country. They had to rewrite their state constitutions. Initially, Lincoln was planning for Reconstruction before the war even ended. He started planning for it in 1863. Unfortunately, obviously, he was when he was assassinated, his vice president took over Reconstruction, Andrew Johnson, who was actually from Tennessee, and he was no friend to African Americans, and he was sort of really all about making it very easy for the states to come back into the Union, and he wasn't really interested in caring for the 4 million former slaves. Think about this, 4 million people who 95% of them could not read or write. They only had the clothes on their backs. They didn't have a place to live. They didn't have access to health care, job training, on and on and on. And so part of Reconstruction is, how are we going to care for these 4 million people? And when Johnson sort of, let's just say, shunned his duties to do that, that's when Congress actually stepped in and he was impeached. And Congress took over Reconstruction. And so the congressional Reconstruction was hard on the South. I mean, that's when the troops were put in the South, and there's a lot of resentments that were built up for that. But we're starting to see African Americans get elected. I mean, the state of Mississippi actually sent 2 African Americans to the U.S. Senate. Okay, so get this, during Reconstruction, and then when Reconstruction ended, we've never seen that happen again. And this has happened in other places. I mean, South Carolina had several African Americans who went to the U.S. House of Representatives, and so that's why I talk about the clock getting turned back. I mean, Louisiana had an African American governor for a time. Last name is Pinchback. He has a unique name, but
When you say that never happened again,
Like Mississippi's never sent an African American to the U.S. Senate since that point.
You mean that state?
That state.
Mississippi.
That state.
I see.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I believe. Well, I'm not gonna. I won't say something that's not true. Yeah.
So Reconstruction, and then we basically go into, from Reconstruction, would you go into the Jim Crow era?
Yeah. Reconstruction ended in 1877, and basically, even that was a compromise because Rutherford B. Hayes was a very close election. He was the Republican, which at the time, the Republican Party and Lincoln was a Republican, and that was really the anti-slavery party. And so Southerner leaders said, hey, we will throw our support behind you, Hayes, if you promise to pull the troops out of the South and end Reconstruction.
Oh, okay.
He said he would. It was a very close election. He wins, and he stayed true to his promise, pulled the troops out of the South, and life goes back to, in many ways, how it looked like before the Civil War. Mm-hmm. So, I would say that really began the Jim Crow era, but I would say it really was cemented with the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision in 1896, which made separate, and I'm putting up air quotes here, separate but equal public accommodations constitutional. So it essentially, the federal government is saying it is okay to have a white school and a black school. They're just supposed to be equal. Unfortunately, and this is what I tell my students, when you hear the term separate but equal, you need to think unequal, because in almost every circumstance, those institutions or those, whether they're hospitals, libraries, parks, were never equal.
Interesting.
So like state of South Carolina is for every, going back to economics, for every dollar they're spending on white schools, they're spending, 15 cents on black schools. And, in some areas didn't even have black schools. Mm-hmm. I mean, in like much of the Mississippi Delta, there weren't hospitals that were admitting African Americans. I mean, even the Red Cross segregated blood and would only give blood. You could, if you're type A, it would be labeled, white type A. And so if you're an African American and you needed that kind of blood, they would not give you that. They would only give you, quote, a black person's blood that was type A.
Wow.
So every aspect of life was segregated. I mean, the city of New Orleans segregated prostitutes based on race.
Wow.
Yeah.
So during the Jim Crow era, is that when we have the Ku Klux Klan just running amok? Is that period of time?
Yeah. I mean, the Ku Klux Klan was started during Reconstruction, and but I would say, and some people would say, oh, it was really this kind of fraternity kind of thing, and maybe there's some truth to that when it was started, but once Reconstruction ended, yes, I think running amok is fair, and it's no coincidence but from that period, so once again, early 1880s to about the 1920s, that's when the high numbers of lynchings happened in America, and so. Brian, I don't know if you're familiar with Brian Stevenson. But he's
an attorney or an author?
He's both.
Okay.
He's an attorney by trade, and he's the one who wrote the book Just Mercy and had the movie come out about his life where Michael B. Jordan was starring him. And he wrote a book called Just Mercy, which I would say is a really great companion with the new Jim Crow. But he does a lot with lynchings, and they have done just so much research. And he started a museum in Montgomery, which has been nicknamed the Lynching Museum. And it's a memorial to those who were lynched, and most of them were during this period by people taking the law in their own hands and murdering in all different ways African Americans. And there's a point between 1900 and 1910 where there was an African American lynched every 3 days in America. And for about a 10-year period. And I mean, the total numbers we're talking about of lynchings, and some we don't even know, but I mean, we're talking about in the thousands and thousands of people with no justice served. to look at some of the things that have happened even recently in our country, and some of these high-profile cases where African Americans have been victimized, and without getting into the details of the cases, these things were not new. These are not new to the African American consciousness. For a lot of white people, it's just this thing that happened in Ferguson or in Florida or in Georgia this year. That's maybe random. That's maybe unfortunate. But we're talking about this happened over and over. So even if you're familiar with the Emmett Till case in 1956, which is a very high-profile lynching of a young African-American boy from Chicago. He was killed in Mississippi. That got the nation's attention because of this great invention we have called the television, and his mother allowing her dead son his picture to be taken, his mutilated body to be taken in at his funeral, so they could see that. People could see that across the country. And so, but that was not new to African Americans. It had been happening for hundreds of years. So I'm jumping around a little bit.
So it took, here's what stands out to me. One of the things is it took the media getting a hold of some of that and kind of spreading it across the country for people to really kind of get, I guess, know that it's going on or have it affect them at a gut level, maybe.
Yeah.
Because that's not that different. That's exactly what just happened with Mr. Arbery.
Yeah.
I mean, that kid was killed on February the 23rd, but no one knew or presumably cared much about it, at least, or not many people, until last week.
Right.
When the video gets released.
Right.
So it's just another one of those things. It's like, man, it's kind of same story, different day. It feels like a little bit.
Well, going back to the, post-Reconstruction, and I try to tell my students, and it's even probably hard for you and I to really understand, what would life have been like living, if you lived in upstate New York or in Middle Tennessee in 1880. I mean, how would you get news? You would get news through, maybe a newspaper, right? And news traveled very slowly. And, even when we look at slavery, there are a lot of people. I mean, if you were living in upstate New York before the Civil War, you might not have ever seen an African-American person, somebody with dark skin. So people were very isolated. And I think that's why some of the stuff happened for so long that people didn't do a lot about.
Yeah.
And it's a great point you make. I mean, even today with, our 24-hour news cycle where we get information so quick, we can still be pretty ignorant or at least turn a blind eye to.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And I think there's even some cases that we actually know about because of cell phone videos or Facebook live streaming or those types of things, where even if it wasn't for that, we wouldn't have access to it because they would have never released it to the public. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
there's another kind of democratization now of news, if you will, air quotes, because we can grab our phone and start videoing, which can be very good.
Right.
That can be very good at times. What was the legal justification for these lynchings back in that day?
That's a good question because people who were against lynchings, which you think everybody would be, but they were trying to pass they were actually trying to pass laws that were called anti-lynching laws, and Southern leaders always blocked it. And so I could be wrong here. So I'm not sure. I don't think there was ever an anti-lynching law passed in any Southern state during this time period. I think some of the justification was, well, we have laws against murder. We have laws against, so why do we need to do this? And it's kind of like a hate crimes, maybe a more modern terminology for it. I think that a lot of I don't know if there was much justification. I just think that there was just a real unwillingness to really seek justice by most people. And so I think, think about, you have a culture and an economy that for so long said that somebody with dark skin is not considered a human being. And so I'm guessing it's hard to change that thinking off overnight. So even when the laws change, I mean, Dr. King said it famously, hey, laws are the easy thing to change. People's hearts are much more difficult. That's the hard change.
Yeah.
And so, if it's, if we read Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, and, he talks about witnessing, the murders of slaves on plantation for no reason than they didn't obey an order, or they didn't follow something that their master had told them. And so I'm guessing that was that same sentiment, that same thought. It's all, at the root of it is we don't consider these people fully human, or they're below us. So therefore, if somebody like Emmett Till, who the reason why he was killed is because he said something to a white woman in public. The reports are he said, "Hey, baby," or he just said, "Hi." I mean, there's different reports. None of it is anything that sounds like it would deserve anything close to the punishment that he ended up receiving.
And he was killed because of that.
Yeah, that very night.
Wow, that's just awful, man.
And let's be clear. The people who did it, the two guys who did it, came to the house of the uncle he was staying with, they took him from the house, put him in the car. He was never seen again. He was found a couple weeks later, and those guys stood trial, all white jury, white judge, segregated courtroom, and they were, after a 1 hour deliberation by the jury, they were set free. They admitted to doing it 3 months later in a Look magazine interview because they couldn't, because of the double jeopardy, they couldn't stand trial for it again. But Emmett Till there were literally thousands, probably tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Emmett Tills before that.
God,
This just got a lot of coverage because of the media. This was on the heels of this was right after Brown versus Board, right before the Montgomery bus boycott with Rosa Parks. So, and this is how the civil rights movement really was gaining momentum with some really great things and some really tragic events.
Yeah. So to be clear, these lynchings, the one every 3 days, they were not technically legal.
No.
Wow. No. Citizens were taking things in their own hands, and the net result was a black person was dying an average of every 3 days. It was not legal, and it was more or less being overlooked.
Yeah. I would really encourage you and whoever's listening to watch the documentary 13th.
Yeah, I just did, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So that's, it's a lot of these topics are touched on, and 13th being the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. And part of the new Jim Crow is that this incarceration is slavery by another name. And so it goes through a lot of that, the lynching stats, and there was, and I'm being careful with your son here, but there were people who would watch these. They were public. They were almost like sporting events, and people would come out and they would sell. I don't know if it was popcorn, but they would sell food and drinks at this, and have people come around. And once again, at the heart of it is this foundational level of seeing other human beings as subhuman, animal. And there's all kinds of, and then you start to bring in the whole Christian thing, and people said, well, if you're from Africa or you're dark skinned, they don't really have a soul, or so therefore it's okay to enslave them, or they come from a pagan continent, and slavery can be the means to transmit the gospel, and so wow, that's a whole nother.
Wow, it's amazing what we are capable of when we start down the path of self-justification. There's no end to that. As you were talking earlier about some of the lynchings, I'd never thought of this, honestly, but there is I think it's a new show on Amazon Prime that has to do with people finding out that there were some Nazis in America. I think it's actually based on a true story, and they hunt them down and basically kill them.
Yes.
These Nazis that wind up in America and have kind of assimilated themselves in American culture.
Yeah,
I haven't watched the show,
in
but
it, I think.
Is he really?
It's kind of a pretty big cast. Yeah.
Yes, that's the show that I'm thinking about. Has that ever happened with these lynchings or this misconduct, these murders of black people across the country? Has anyone ever kind of taken it upon themselves to hunt these people down and serve justice at the hand of how they see fit?
That's a good question.
I've never heard of it.
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, I do think that some of the, when you think about and not to this extreme, but when it helps you understand even some African Americans in the late 60s who were maybe more militant, thinking about the Black Panthers of, this idea that, and it was not to that extreme, but still this idea of, hey, we have to protect ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
It's the self-justification on the other side of, hey, we're going to carry these weapons because, we can't trust that our community is going to be protected.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not that I've heard of.
Yeah, I haven't either, which I guess is both good and bad. Picking up then from, you said there was a lynching that happened as recent as the 50s then we have kind of this period of time, was it 60s, where we had the civil rights movement?
I would date the civil rights movement starting in 54. This is my personal and others, but with the Brown versus Board of Education, which desegregated schools on May 17th, 54. And some people date it differently, but I would take it to 68 with the assassination of Dr. King. Some people say the civil rights movement really ended at Selma and the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So kind of mid 50s to, I'd say, late 60s.
Yeah. Okay. As you kind of survey where we are today, then, in 2020, or at least, this century, where are you seeing, I mean, this is a big question, but where are you seeing the systemic or institutional racism or just racism in general today? Like where are those pockets or areas, not geographically, but the issues? Well,
I do think that some of the mass incarceration, as I've touched on, and I keep looking at your book, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. Some of the mass incarceration, I think, would be an example of some of this continuing. I mean, there has been some positive things that have happened, and it's actually one of the few bipartisan issues that we've started to see where actually Republicans and Democrats have come together. There's a novel idea to help in this issue, just with the disproportionate number of African Americans who have been, prosecuted for various things. This goes back to the war on drugs and not to get into all the details, but I'd say that's an institution. We've talked a lot about education. I think that's something, and this is, getting back to the guilt thing. A lot of our schools have resegregated, obviously in larger cities. And, I have good friends in the metro school system, and I have a good friend who's sort of a higher up in administration. And some of their schools are 90+% Black or people of color, and so some of the white flight and moving to suburbs and even and private schools establishment have. So I think we talking about educational reform and that's certainly a really important one.
Yeah.
And I just think that once again, I think, for me, foundational is, I think diversity is good. I think it's good for people to be together and to learn from one another. And I think a lot of people see diversity as not necessarily a good thing. I think it's a good thing. And so I just think at all levels, as a Christian, churches are still very segregated. And so I just think at every level of where we are, we have to be intentional. And this is tiring and difficult work.
Yeah.
That, you're talking about fruit. You might not see fruit for a long time.
Yeah.
And it's, I do think there's institutional things that happen. I do think that, and I think it's good when the federal government does some things, but it's also at the relational, personal level. And, the reason why I can, I hurt more when something happens in the African American community is because I have African American friends who feel it deeply, and it's not theoretical or distant. I am close friends with Anthony and Carla Hendricks, and we are, bound together. And something hurts me, it hurts him, and it hurts him, it hurts me, and we can go down the line. And I think that going back to that New Hope Academy experience, I mean, when the way that school has changed my children is because they have been in relationship with African American, Hispanic families. They're in their homes. They know them, and this is not just random. I mean, the school is intentionally about it. For the last 18 years, they have an African American headmaster who is leading that school. There's two different individuals now, but so two different tenures, but who are leading that school, speaking to them, and so I think that at the personal level, it's so important for us to be intentional. At Brentwood Academy, I mean, I'm having conversations all the time. If we think diversity is good, is our board diverse? Is our administration? Is our faculty? Is our student body? When I was the sponsor for the student leadership team, if I thought it was important for African Americans to be on the student leadership team, this is an organization where you have to fill out an application, you have to, people vote, then I better be reaching out and saying, hey, whatever your name, you need to, I think you would be awesome on the student leadership team. Please, if you want African Americans in the plays, it doesn't necessarily always happen naturally. Be intentional. If you want them to come on the retreats, I mean, there's a time at our school where African Americans didn't come on overnight retreats.
Didn't care to.
Different reasons. I don't know if there's a uncertainty, a distrust about going in the country, about staying in this rural place, about maybe with other white people. I don't know the reasons, but so for me and others who were with me, we're like, we just had to ask them, hey, why don't you come on this retreat? And guess what? They'll come. And so, I think for our churches, do you want a diverse church? Do you have diverse elder board? Do you have, leadership? So it's way easier said than done, but to being intentional. And some people are turned away by that. They're like, oh, that sounds like affirmative action, or that sounds like whatever, quotas. That's not what I'm saying. I mean, if you want to label it that, that's fine. Kind of like the liberal comment, but I just think we have to be super intentional.
Yeah, for sure. I totally agree. What would you say to people that have seen or heard over the last, the last 5 years, let's just say, because it's happened a ton in the last 5 years. These black men, a lot of them young black men getting killed, whether it's by police officers or other citizens, but they justify it like, yeah, but he was reaching for a pill bottle in his pocket, or yeah, but he was reaching for a wallet, or yeah, but, I don't know how they justify some of these things. There's one guy that was shot in his car. He had a legal carry permit. He told the police officer that he had a gun in the car. It was totally legal, and he got shot. I can promise you one thing, Brad. If I was in that car with my skin color and I told the cop that I had a gun in the car, I'd still be alive. Yeah. 100% of me believes that.
I believe that too.
But they come up with, reasons. I just hear, I don't need to even say some of these things just get wacky so fast, but it seems to me that there is a need to justify some of these things. And they come up with some pretty crazy excuses. What do you say to that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, in full disclosure, my father is a retired police officer, worked Tennessee State Trooper his whole life. My brother is a Tennessee State Trooper, Lieutenant Colonel. He's kind of up there.
So you guys checked all the hotspot boxes, haven't you?
Yeah. So and I think for one thing, there's often a false dichotomy. I can be for African Americans and against the vilification of African American young men, and I can also be for police and first responders or whatever. And so the idea that you're on one side or the other is just false dichotomy. It's not real. It's not true. I can tell you from my my dad and talking to my brother, I mean, they've done some intentional things in terms of their training, and generally speaking, police forces are among our more diverse groups. Now, I think that can be a little localized at times, but so I think that's the first thing I want to say on the front end. The second thing is I think that we get, once again, going back to the I can't say that word, but politicizing things, we get put in another false dichotomy of these camps. And I just think, once again, if you're in relationship, even if you're just coming to these situations with a blank slate, if you're in relationship with people, in a diverse group of people, it's much harder to simply see it as one way. And so, to me, I'm with you. I think that these things that we're seeing have gone on for a long time, and I think you can trace them back to lynchings, but because of our, we got a phone and a camera in every pocket. Now we're seeing some of these things happen, and we have been for a while now. I think it's real. I know that my students, they tell me my African American students, their parents have to have the talk with them, the conversation of, hey, if you're driving in Brentwood or whatever white community neighborhood, make sure you are, driving the speed limit. Make sure you have, if you get pulled over, you keep both hands on the wheel so they can always see your hands. Don't make any quick movements, and on and on and on. Well, I have 3 drivers in my home, children, and I've never had that conversation with them. I don't have to have that conversation with them. So that's real. And it's not playing the race card or race baiting or something. I mean, there's a real, even take out the stuff, all these incidents in the last decade, our history, going back, our history matters. And so you have parents who, and grandparents who go back. I mean, I tell my kids all the time, we might watch a documentary about Selma or something that happened in the South in the 60s. I'm like, look, if my parents walked in the room, you wouldn't think they're that old. They lived during that. They were alive.
Yes.
There are cars driving down the street here. We're not watching, horses and buggies or artist rendition of something that happened. This is actual footage of this African-American man getting beaten up in downtown Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957 in broad daylight by a mob, and he's doing nothing wrong. And so, I think that we've got to allow ourselves to be taught by our history, to learn from it. I think that, anyway, I'm getting a little long-winded.
No, it's good. I mean, there's definitely a lot there. I was going to ask you this. So you teach African-American history at Brentwood Academy. Is this, what are we talking here? Like African-American history in America or the whole thing? Or how far back do you go?
Good question. We start with race in the Bible, like I said, foundational, and I do it pretty quick. But, and then one of the things I try to do is bust some of the myths. Okay. So, and even some of the, misinterpretations of the Bible. So like, Genesis 9:27, the quote, curse of Ham was used to justify the enslavement of dark-skinned peoples because Ham was the dark-skinned son of Noah. Well, the interesting thing about that is Ham wasn't cursed. It was Canaan. And curses didn't work like that. And they were, usually 3 or 4 generations, and it would certainly never involve sinning against people in order to, as a punishment for this curse, right?
Right.
And so, I mean, so things like that, even the idea of like interracial, you mentioned that earlier, interracial dating and marriage. I mean, there's a passage in 2 Corinthians called, that talks about unequally yoked believers not being unequally yoked to unbelievers. Has nothing to do with races.
No one says that, do they?
It uses a metaphor of lightness and darkness. Okay, spiritual light and dark, and that
Some people use that as justification for
yes,
outlawing interracial marriage.
Used to be.
Holy cow!
And I'm sure there's still some who do. But I mean, but it's, I can remember, and even if generally speaking, if I ask my students, hey, are your parents, would they be cool if you dated somebody of a different race or married somebody of a different race? And let me be clear. People who are white and black would say, no, I've got family members who would not like that. Okay. Maybe it's a grandparent, maybe it's a mom or a sibling, but so there's still some of that obviously going. But once again, I want to look at it from the biblical perspective. Anyway, so we do that. Some other myths. So we do some African history, kind of before the transatlantic slave trade, because there's this notion, I think, with a lot of people that, Africa was just always this backwards country or continent, and they were, the kind of images of like Tarzan or something, and that's not true. I mean, there was thriving cultures who, in some cases, were way more advanced than civilizations in Europe. So when Europe was stuck in the Middle Ages, there's Alexandria in Egypt, there's Timbuktu, which is in Western Africa, which were these thriving centers of trade and education. There was huge universities and libraries, technological advancements, scientific advancements that are happening there when most of Europe is stuck in the Middle Ages. So we do some real basic. I mean, most of the early church fathers, the leaders of the church, were African, including Augustine and Cyprian and Origen. Were all. I mean, in many ways, the church was an African church. For the first couple hundred years after Christ. And
so it's a safe bet that Saint Augustine was black.
Well, I think he was dark. He was probably darker skinned than you or I.
That's a pretty safe bet. Most people are, unfortunately.
So and going back to race in the Bible, I mean, there's a lot. I think there was a lot of our heroes of the faith that were dark skinned that we know this about, and so. Anyway, so then we look at, I do a little short history of slavery and different slave systems, including the trans-Saharan slave trade, which was happening in Africa before European countries or European slave traders came into the continent and apprehended Africans and took them across the Atlantic Ocean for the purpose of sort of oppressing them into slavery. So we talk about how did that happen? Why did it happen when it did? What were the factors in Europe, in West Africa, and in, quote, the New World that made the transatlantic slave trade what it would become? I mean, there's really no good statistics, but most scholars believe there were between 15 and 50 million Africans that were taken. Now, many didn't even make it to the coast or the slave ships. Many died on the voyage itself. Most went to, South America, the Caribbean, and North America. Some went to India and parts of Asia. Some went to other parts of Africa. So we do a pretty big study of that. Then we get into sort of the colonial era in what will become America. How did slavery develop? What about free? Because there's always a free population of, I can't call them African Americans, of black settlers or black people who were in the colonies. And then we get into so what was happening with the Declaration of Independence. I mean, initially, this is a fun fact. Thomas Jefferson, who's principal author of the Declaration of Independence, also a slave holder, was very critical of slavery in the early drafts of the Declaration of Independence. And he's really kind of pointing his finger in the eye of King George, right? He's making it as if King George is the reason why slavery happened. And this was going to be part of the Declaration of Independence. If you go read it today, you'll see nothing about slavery. Why is that? Well, because Southern colonies, mainly South Carolina and Georgia, said, we're not signing that document if you're critical of slavery. So when you think about that John Hancock signature, all those signatures of the leaders, those delegates, I don't know the word for them, but at the Continental Congress were not willing to sign it because they, once again, they were fearful that, hey, if we win this war, when it comes, because they knew it was going to come, we don't want slavery to end. Okay, so once again, you see compromise. So the Northern delegates were like, we got to all be together if we're going to beat the Brits, if we're going to beat the British. So they compromised it out of the Declaration of Independence. So there's nothing about slavery. So we talk about that in the Constitution, as I mentioned earlier, and we get into, obviously, the events that led up to the Civil War. Then we studied Reconstruction, Jim Crow era, and I break that up. And in the middle of the Jim Crow era, I'll do a study on the history of jazz music. It's fun, it's unique, and in many ways, jazz music is very much connected to our history, to what was happening in the early Jim Crow period to right up through the Civil Rights movement. So we kind of, and there's also a connection to like the Harlem Renaissance. And then we look at the Civil Rights movement. And then I finished the year, which was a little truncated this year because of the coronavirus, but with what I just call it the post-Civil Rights movement. So we go from, post Dr. King's assassination right up to the present day. And throughout the year, we will look at current event issues. Okay.
Oh, fascinating.
So we're talking about, some of the debates on the statues and, if there is like, whatever happens in the news. And one of my first assignments I do at the beginning of the year is I give them a real narrow focus. You can look from 4 different sources. Usually it's like the Tennessean, USA Today, New York Times, maybe Wall Street Journal, because I know they can get those too at Starbucks. You got a weekend, 3 days, bring in an article about race, only those 4 sources. And they're like, what if there's nothing? Okay, then you don't have to do it. And the point is, there's always multiple articles.
I was just going to say
year.
that. How do you?
Well,
I just pick a random weekend.
It's right at the beginning of school, so it's usually like the second class. And the point I want to make to them is our race matters now too. This is not just something we're studying the history, because I am taking a gamble. And I guess the point is if there's no issues, then maybe we can stop teaching the class. I don't know.
Yeah.
But there's always multiple articles that show up, even in just those few. So I guess my point is I always try to keep one foot in the present as we're studying our past. And so if something happens like it happened in Georgia, I'm not going to act like it didn't happen. And while we're studying, whatever, the Constitution, we're going to talk about it.
You're taking a real pragmatic approach to this thing. It's not just knowledge for the sake of head knowledge, but it's knowledge that can inform action today, it sounds like.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the cool thing about the class is I typically, our school, I think we have about 18% people of color in our school. But usually a large number of African Americans will take the class.
I was going to ask about that.
So in some years I've had, about a 50-50 breakdown. Usually I have 2 sections. So I'll have a good number, a significant number of African Americans in the classroom. So we can have real dialogue and real conversation. And we talk about stuff like, real practical things like church and integration and friends. And when you go to college, fraternities, everything in our culture wants to separate and divide us. So even when they go to college, fraternities are segregated. The Christian organizations are often segregated, not necessarily intentionally, but that's how it plays out. And your roommates are the same race as you. And if you go to church, hopefully you do, you go to segregated churches, and then, the cycle just continues. And so we're talking about things like that.
You said something that I think I heard it right, but I definitely did not know about this. It kind of sounded like at one point, people from all over the world were going to Africa and making those people their slaves. It wasn't just coming to North America.
Well, most of the people who were who were enslaving them were from Europe. And so the Portuguese were the first, and it started very small, and it developed pretty slowly. As the Portuguese, they were the dominant power because they had the most ships. They had the biggest navy. They could travel farther, and that also increased, helped you in trade, which meant money. And then the Spaniards, and then the Dutch and the British, and other countries like France got involved as well. But so really, they're talking about European countries, because with this quote age of exploration, which sounds very romantic,
Right.
it's really about colonization. And so these countries, small countries, which are like states, right, are competing with one another. And they are trying to establish these colonies all over the world to make the mother country stronger, richer, more powerful. And there was the famous phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," because literally it didn't. The British had, Canada. They had these, 13 colonies. They had some Barbados and other colonies in the Caribbean, parts of South America. They had these spheres of influence in China, Hong Kong, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. They controlled the Nile River, so really from Egypt all the way to South Africa. So quite literally from little old England, I lived in Scotland for a time. I got my master's degree, but from little old England, they were the number one power in the world because they had all these holdings. They had the largest navy, and what was undergirded, and so the colonies, I always teach my students, was the foundation of their economy. The cornerstone of the economy that held it all together was slavery.
Wow.
So when they outlawed slavery in 1833, the British colonial system is slowly evaporates, descends, and they slowly lose power to the point of World War II, where they're no longer the number one power in the world. So people are right. The livelihood of governments, of countries, of the American South did depend on slavery. It's wrong,
Yeah,
but it did.
Yeah, for sure. Well, another thing, as you were talking through that, you can't get away from the fact that the South. How do you put it? The South is more involved here. The South has some responsibility here that not all the states have. The South is more complicated. How would you put it? But these issues are all over the country today, right?
Yeah.
Most people would agree with that. This is not just a thing of the South. However, the South was extra culpable, I guess. How would you think through that? The South does have a history that not all of the country here has.
Yeah, definitely. I think that Dr. King said famously, and I think it was in '67, if folks in Alabama want to learn how to hate, they need to come to Chicago. And because he was really looking at some of the housing discrimination, segregation that was happening in Chicago, job opportunities. And if you look at the history of Chicago, the political system
Mob.
in that city was just so strong, and it was very racist. And so for sure, I think that, the thing that the South cannot get away from, though, is, the legacy of slavery.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, we can't get away from that. And so I don't know if the northern, weather systems were different, and if northern states could have these long growing seasons where they grew cotton, would they have just,
that's interesting.
So it's not, I don't know if it's because I don't know if it's really fair to say that they were just more enlightened either.
Yeah, interesting.
And so, but I think that's almost an argument that really we almost waste time with,
right.
Because I think we can, at least you and I can agree that the hearts of men and women are just wicked and broken, and so sin is real, and it
100%. And there's lots of examples of systemic racism in the North, including redlining.
Absolutely.
And a whole bunch of other things.
Yep.
Is there places in the world where white people and black people have sort of figured it out and are existing just in a much better fashion than they are here in America? One of the things that Anthony and I talked about yesterday, and I don't even know what I'm basing this on. I think I'm basing it on movies, but I kind of feel like they've figured out how to how to abide together properly, or at least a lot more properly, or racism is a lot less of an issue in like London, say, or England than here. Is that even true? Maybe it's not. I mean, is there places in the world where you see black and white people existing more as they should be than here in America?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't know if I can really answer that. I mean, I think that one thing that England, say, doesn't have is they. I just talked about their legacy of slavery, but they didn't have a civil war that ended slavery. They actually ended it through parliaments. And I don't know if you ever studied William Wilberforce, but he's a
I have a book on the way about him.
Yeah, he's great.
Yeah.
And he was really fighting it for his whole life. But they don't have that Civil War piece, I think, which is a big factor. And I think a lot of the problems and even the hanging on to symbols like we see in the American South is because of the Civil War. I mean, one thing not to get off track here, but once Reconstruction ended, it's really that first generation after the Civil War ended that the monuments started to get put up. We're talking about, I mean, the monument in the Franklin Square was 1899. This was not put up 5 years after the Civil War ended. There were the creation of these daughters of the Confederacy that were literally the daughters of men who fought for the South, and they wanted to commemorate and honor. But the problem was when the troops were all gone, and you have this system of white supremacy. It was also a symbol of, hey, this is who we're honoring. These are the people that we are worshiping, so to speak. That's when, and the flag, the battle flag, was really brought back out 30, 40, 50 years later, as ways to, I'm not saying this was every person's intent, but what I think it did was it became these symbols of hate and oppression for people. Like, we're hearkening back to the good old days here. And I don't even know how I got on this point. Oh, we're talking about England.
Yeah.
So I think the Civil War is it's a hard thing to get away from, and the legacy and just the impact that it had.
That's insightful. That thought never crossed my mind. I think that's pretty significant. Is that statue still in downtown Franklin?
It is.
And I've been to downtown Franklin a whole bunch and never really looked at a statue. What is the statue?
Yeah, it's a general soldier. It's not a general. It's not Robert E. Lee or anything like that. It's just a kind of an unnamed soldier. And it's, the problem I have with the statue, well, I have a few problems. One, there is a Confederate flag on the side of it that you don't necessarily notice unless you walk up. But when you read the inscriptions on there, it's it's pretty telling about what that culture, those people valued. And obviously, when you put that in this prominent place in the middle of town, this town that was marked by the Civil War, that was marked by this fighting over, and I teach my students, look, some people will say the Civil War, the primary reason was not for slavery. I'm not one of those people. I believe it was about slavery, and you could say states' rights. Well, it was about the states' rights to own slaves, and so that symbol is in such a prominent place in our town, and and it's no coincidence that when that monument was put up in 1899, if you've been on the Franklin Square, you know where Mellow Mushroom is?
Yeah.
On the corner? Okay. I go to Mellow Mushroom a lot.
Yeah.
Well, that was where the headquarters of the KKK was at that same time, right there on the square.
No.
Nobody's trying to hide it back in the day.
The headquarters for what? For Franklin?
The
KKK?
local chapter of the Ku Klux Klan was right there.
Wow. How old is that building? In that building?
It was a different building.
Okay.
Yeah, different building on that spot.
Oh my gosh.
But when you in the old courthouse, which was there before, if you look go to the courthouse, there's engravings like carved into the wall, really nice, and it has the war dead from World War I and World War II, from people from Franklin who died in the war, and it lists everybody, and at the bottom it lists the colored soldiers. at the bottom. So, I guess it's good that they at least got recognized, because that wasn't always the case. But even the way we list our dead, we segregate.
And that was in the 40s, right?
Well, World War I was late teens, and also World War II. So, yes, in the 40s. World War II ended in 45.
Okay. Wow.
So all these things are together, right? They're all right there. And even right now, as we speak, there's 3 flags that are in front of the courthouse right beside Mellow Mushroom. One is there's an American flag, there's like a Franklin kind of city flag, and then there's a Williamson County flag that on I don't know what you call it, but there's like the symbol. It's got 4 quadrants on it. One representing land, one representing education, one representing faith, and one representing something else I can't remember. But there's a Confederate flag in the very the logo of Williamson County, and it's on that flag. And I guess I just have a problem with that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, then I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about what you guys are doing at the public as well.
Yeah.
But it sounds like the location that you guys have chosen for these meetings is actually a lot more strategic, whether it's by intent or not, than I initially thought.
Yeah. So the public, I know we had talked before, but and I don't know if Anthony talked about it too much,
didn't.
But it was pretty grassroots. I mean, there was a lot of some of these crimes and murders that happened with some African Americans that we've touched on in our country. There's also a lot of debate happening in schools about diversity training in the Williamson County schools. There's some things that I was dealing with in my school. And so all these, and there's also the debate about statues and kind of post-Charlottesville. And so because of all these things, we had some friends of ours who were talking, like, we need to have a forum where people, black, white, Christian, non-Christian, doesn't matter, can come together and talk. Because what we've kind of come to realize is that we get in our little camps and our huddles, and there's never any dialogue. We're always missing each other, right? So, you can even look on the news. You got, Fox News is going this way, and CNN, and MSNBC is going this way. And so, so we wanted to try to do this. So it was actually at the MLK Walk a couple of years ago. There's a march in Franklin every year, which is great. And I ran into Anthony. I saw him at Starbucks, and he had pretty recently moved back to the community. And so I said, hey, we need to talk. And so we started having a conversation about how would you think about if you and I were sort of moderating and talking about these issues in a public forum. And he's a pastor by trade. He's not in the ministry formally right now, but I'm a teacher. We have very different personalities, and we really also thought that this public we might use it to talk about other things. Race was just kind of pressing right now. It's something I'm passionate about.
Interesting.
So maybe we would talk about the environment or whatever it might be. Education reform, whatever. And we just haven't gotten off race yet. So we had 4 meetings. We met every other Thursday night at Merides. We didn't want to meet in a church. We didn't want it to something that would maybe turn people off. We didn't want to meet in a school. We wanted to be actually in a public place where people could come and eat. And you can have a beer if you want at the public. And it wasn't also just about us talking, and sometimes we would do kind of a back and forth. Sometimes we would just open it up for questions. Sometimes we'd have a topic. We'd talk about things going on in the news. We've had speakers come in. And so I think we've met, I think I counted them up 12 times. We did 4 times in the spring, and then 4 times last fall. Then we had met 4 times right before the COVID-19 hit. And we'd also done some cool things, like we sponsored a trip to Montgomery, to the museums that I mentioned earlier, where about 30 people went down there. And then we were privy to a early showing of the film Just Mercy about Brian Stevenson's life, and we were able to invite people from the public to that at the Thoroughbred Cool Springs movie theaters, and then we had a discussion about it just right there in the theater. So and we have a Facebook site where we post just like recommended book readings and books to read and documentaries and things like that. It's just a list, and so just this public forum where people can come and hear and talk, and I think what we found is there's a lot of people who were maybe just starting to think about some of these things, or maybe even white families who had adopted children of a different race, and they were starting to be confronted with these issues that maybe they hadn't even anticipated so much. So it was really interesting, the quote kinds of people that were really resonating and connecting with it.
For the local people interested, where could they find out about or get notified about the next meeting?
Well, we've been on a little bit of let me back up for a second. We've talked about maybe trying to do a Zoom meeting.
Okay.
And, I think one thing that's held us back from it a little bit is it is very relational, and it's meant to be public and where people can talk. And
Zoom doesn't sound fun at all.
Yeah.
I've been on a few Zoom calls.
I've been teaching for the last 2 months on Zoom, and my students were all Zoomed out. So I'm hopeful that we can, we can start back soon, obviously in an environment that's safe. And we've been meeting at Merity's, which is in downtown Franklin. It's been there for a long time, almost 40 years. And they've been very gracious, where there's kind of a section of the restaurant where we can meet and people can still come in and don't have to be a part of it and still have their night. So they've been very gracious to us. And so the short answer is I don't have a real quick answer because of our current predicament.
Yeah, but you said there is a Facebook group.
Yes, it is.
So if they just search on Facebook for the Public,
the Public, right? Yep.
PUBLIC.
Yes,
I think it was.
Yep.
Okay, on Facebook. And then get information.
Yeah, and you can get on. We have a mailing list, and
okay.
So
I'd like to get on that.
Yeah.
Do you have a website too? Or you just get on the mailing list through the Facebook page?
Yep.
Okay, yeah. I mean, that's the way Facebook is going. That's what a lot of people are doing now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to get on that mailing list because I'd love to. I had heard about it, but I actually thought they only had one meeting. So
we've live streamed it and we record it so people can take part even if they're not there. And,
oh, wow.
And so that's been cool. We've had people who are different parts of the country who have watched. I have friends in Seattle, and they're like, "Oh, I wish we had something like this going here." And I'm like,
"Oh, wow, that is really cool." Yeah. So, maybe you guys need to somehow franchise that thing. Not there'd be a fee, but you know what I mean? Like, give the template out somehow. Here's what we meet this often. These make good moderators. We have these kind of discussions, and somehow get this across the country.
Yeah, and part of it is, we have to. There's, it's not very too formal. We just say, hey, this is meant to be a safe space. This is meant to be a place where, hey, you can disagree and about something that's said or something, whatever. And we do a lot of table discussion as well. So typically our meetings are an hour and a half. Merity's closes at 9. We start at 7. We'll go for an hour and a half that usually involves some type of interaction with whoever shows up, whether it's questions or table discussions that we kind of give them some parameters around. And we just, once again, want to be a really safe place where people are going to be, we're all at different places on this journey. Just as soon as I think I've gotten all the racism rid out of my heart, it creeps up. I'm talking about me personally. So we are all, hopefully moving towards this place of that we call racial unity or racial justice or racial reconciliation. And so hopefully it's a safe space and we try to create that. And then we leave the last 30 minutes before Merity's closes. We stop at 8:30 and we're like, hey, now you just hang out. Get to know each other more. Yeah. And because we typically have a diverse crowd that comes and table fellowship's important. And so we want that to be fostered on its own.
Are you getting any Hispanic representation there, or is that fairly limited?
We've had some, and we've actually thought about one of our, because there is a growing Hispanic population in Franklin and Williamson County and a lot at New Hope, and there's some strong churches as well. And we have actually, I think probably our next, we might keep the conversation on race going, but direct it a little more towards the Hispanic population because we've really focused on black and white a lot, but I do think in our age of, with some of the immigration things that have been national, that we've, like I said, we've had the hard time kind of moving on. You never can move on. So we probably just need to, be intentional about looking at other topics under this umbrella of race, but we have.
Yeah.
So,
have you had some contentious questions or open contention there?
Yeah, I can't recall anything that's been belligerent or,
okay.
I mean, there's definitely people who have, I'll just say, push back against something that I've said or something that Anthony said or even, but typically speaking, I think it's all been done in a positive way. Yeah. I mean, Anthony, he's taught some classes in different settings, and notably a church setting. He was asked to teach a class at a church in Nashville that he doesn't attend about race, and he's had some contentious people there.
Yeah.
But the good thing is he was really supported by the leadership and in those cases. So,
yeah. Well, Anthony was sitting in your chair that you're sitting in yesterday, and he had like a semi-tight long sleeve tee on. He looked like he'd be able to handle some contention if it did arise.
Yeah.
It's like, man, what are you doing to work out? He has some really nice biceps.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think he's 54 years old, right? Did you say, Lincoln? He does not look 54 years old.
No.
For sure. Where are you seeing where's the hope? Where's the bright spots? What's going on that you kind of see around that gives you some, where do you see the promise?
Okay. So that's a great question. I think the hope is honestly, I see it in some of my students, where, and even, some of the people that we've encountered at, the public who really come in. It's hard to say a blank slate. We all have baggage, but they come in open, or they come in just not knowing that much about the history, and leaving with a real sense of, hey, I want to be somebody who's a part of the solution. I want to be an agent of reconciliation, if you will. And so, I have a class of students who are literally going, all over the world. I got a girl who's going to NYU. I've got a student who's going to Hampton, which is a historically black college in Virginia. One is going to Emory in Atlanta. One is going to Baylor in Texas, and just all over. And every one of those students are, I believe they're going to go and be real intentional about creating diverse and reconciling communities. And I say community in a real literal way, on their college campuses. Might just be in their hall. They're going to be really agents of racial justice. Mm-hmm. And so seeing young people, seeing some of these kids that are coming out of New Hope and what they've been about, that's a pretty hopeful place for me. Yeah. I think that people, first of all, I can look at my own life and certainly where my family's come through, that change has happened in my heart. That's true. Yeah. Change has happened, and I'm constantly changing. And so, that's what I try to look through in some of the dark days.
Yeah. So you're not giving up hope.
No.
Do you think though that that is difficult? Do you think there are a lot of black people in this country that do struggle with just kind of giving up hope on this?
Yes.
That it's just not going to get that much better.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. That absolutely. Just because I've friends of mine and I've heard them say it, and Anthony's is he shared openly with me and publicly, that, he has moments where he loses hope. And, obviously, our faith, I don't think it's an option to not have hope at some level, right?
Yeah.
That if you believe in redemption, you believe in change, then, okay, that's really, we got to believe in it.
Yeah.
But I definitely think that's the case.
Yeah.
With some.
I was going to ask you, is any of your class material available to the public online or anywhere? Like the things that you're teaching in your classes?
Yeah. A lot of my notes or quote my lectures are, a lot of them are just, I mean, I've done it so long I don't even need it at some level. A lot of it's bullet point kind of stuff, but yeah, I mean, everything I've gotten from other people.
Yeah, yeah. But it's not like your lectures can be just found on like BrentwoodAcademy.com or anything like that. It's not quite that easy.
I have my lesson plans. It would have to be, you can access it. It would be way too complicated. Like my parents and students can all get it for sure. It's just, but I'm an open book for sure.
Yeah. What do you have any thoughts on what's going on with Ahmaud Arbery, the case there?
I do. I think that the number one, I think the thing that really stands out to me is, and once again, we're in such a weird time right now, but I'd really love to see our predominantly white churches, come out and make this an issue. Make this a point that, I get that people are, but I hear white churches and pastors don't have a problem talking about, abortion or prayer in schools or even schooling and other things from the pulpit. And I'm not saying you have to put a whole sermon series around it or anything like that, but I would love to see our churches, the white churches, and this goes back to even maybe what we were saying earlier about teaching to predominantly white people, that there's just something because we live such segregated lives that a lot of white people either they don't want to believe it, like, because that's just being pushed by a liberal agenda, or he must have done something wrong, or that's or maybe a fear of criticizing like the police or the law enforcement or the justice system. And I would just like to see, I think, more white churches and leadership really take this on as this issue. I'm speaking a little broader than this one specific one, but to say, hey, we need to talk about this. We need to deal with this. And I think they're all connected. I mean, even when when it was a big deal with some of the stuff going on around the symbols, the Confederacy and the statues. I mean, the Nathan Bedford Forrest bust at the Capitol building, that's an ongoing issue. And I'd just love to see evangelical, conservative Christian groups take it on, and not be so afraid. I think the political thing is what keeps a lot of white folks from it, because it's seen as, that's a liberal thing to care about race, or that's a, and to be against law enforcement or against, is a liberal thing. And I think we got to get rid of that language and that false dichotomy.
I agree. I mean, I think it's from the devil, because usually the best way to get us is not just put blatant sin in front of us. It's to give us something a little less than good to focus on, distract with, get it. You know what I mean? Like there's a strategy there. It's not going to be as easy as, there's racism and we're not going to care about that. That's obviously wrong. But if you can make it political and get people tied up in their political views, then you've got them. Yeah,
if you lived in Tennessee in 1840 before the Civil War and you were against slavery, you're liberal. You were liberal on that issue. And if you are living in Georgia in 1956 and you were for school integration, okay, white and black kids coming to school together, you're liberal. To be conservative is to conserve history, to conserve what has been going on, to keep doing what you've been doing. So to go against that is a liberal, and I think Jesus would have been against slavery. He would have been for integration. So on those points, Jesus was liberal and conservative. I talk about that with my students. He says, "Well, we didn't come to abolish the law. I've come to fulfill it." Okay, so he saw the law as good. That's a conservative point. Okay, but the way he was treating outsiders and caring for women and uplifting these other groups in society, making the Samaritan the good guy in this story, those are liberal points. Those are progressive, whatever word you want to use. And so, we have this, no party is God's party, right?
Yeah.
Jesus wasn't a Republican or a Democrat.
Yep. Yeah, Christ-like. Maybe that's the word we need to use instead of liberal. Christ-like.
Yeah. Amen.
Well, Brad, I gotta let you go, but thank you so much for your time. This was a real honor, privilege. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Kent. The privilege was mine.
Yeah.
I really enjoy, as much as this can be a really hard topic for a lot of people, I do enjoy talking about it. And, maybe part of it is my story is, my family history. Going back is not good. Mm-hmm. And so I can't hide behind, I didn't do this, or my family was always great on the issue of race. And so maybe that frees me up a little bit. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I appreciate the opportunity. I love history, and I love talking about this topic.
Yeah, it's evident. Your story's fascinating. It's powerful. So keep talking about it. Anything you'd want to leave with the listeners as we draw to a close here?
No, I would just say I would encourage people to. There's a lot of great books. There's a lot of great documentaries and movies about these issues, and to read and to educate yourself, and to personally do the research a little bit, and not let. And I'm going either direction. Not let the news media overly influence you. Even maybe, and this might be bad, but even, what you've been told in the past overly influence you. Do some of the research yourself. Read a book like The New Jim Crow, or The Children, about the civil rights movement in Nashville, written by David Halberstam many years ago. I would encourage people to do that.
Yeah. Good. Brad Perry, thank you very much.
Thank you, Kent.